Hello, everyone. Like Dr. Conde said, my name's Hayleigh Stonham. I'm a senior studying art history. I have curated an exhibition in conjunction with this thesis, and it's centered around reconstructing the perspectives of these British women artists from 1880 to 1930. And what's notable about this period is that this is during the second wave of the Industrial Revolution over in Britain. So with this massive industry movement comes a massive movement for social rights and social movements for women, because that was the starting ground. If we were going to seek equality for all, it had to start at like the gendered perspective. Hold on. What started all of this was not Louise Joplin, but it was another artist named Miss Amy E. Fisher. I was interning at the museum, and I was trying to do some cataloging for this artist, and I was trying to research more on her and her biography and any data that I could find on her, and I found nothing. All I found about her was that she exhibited at the Royal Academy at London for 24 years between the years 1866 to 1890, and that was it. And what's so remarkable about that is that it's very difficult for a woman to even exhibit, let alone exhibit at the Royal Academy at London. And the factor in that is that she was notable enough to exhibit at this royal institution, but she was not notable enough to have history written about her. We know that she traveled, which is also another factor that should be an obstacle for a woman at this time. So she had to either have a companion with her, because we know this information because we have an artwork from her that is titled Italy, and it's a tavern scene. It's on show at the in my gallery right now, and it was made in 1880. It's a remarkable watercolor piece, and it is very distinct for the fact that she showed this like all around Europe. But once more, there's no information about her. There's no birthday, there's no death date, there's nothing. And so I went down the spiral, essentially, where I was researching artists, and I decided to pick 3 artists for my thesis. The 3 of them are Louise Joplin, Dorothy Hoxley, and Helen Allingham. These 3 artists are very similar yet different. They have class distinctions, they have the wealth disparities within themselves and their families, and they have different art styles and circles that they were surrounded by. And I wanted to examine the different artists within different associations, because I wanted to see if the bias within the art historians and the art critics of that period affected the matter of them being remembered in history. And that's an important thing for an artist and for most historical aspects, and for us today, is that if you're not written about, if you don't have literature written on you, or if you, like today, if you don't have like your Facebook or your social media, you're not going to be remembered later on. You have to have some written history about you for you to be remembered, and that can be a war zone, especially if you are in a movement that is pushing against the very fact that you are having a career in a time that you should not be having a career, that the pushback is immense. In Britain, there was the women weren't allowed to get separated from their husbands legally and officially until 1870 with the Married Women's Act. And Louise Joplin, she was born in 1843, and she had a whole family. She was starting to establish her career in the arts through her first husband, Francis Romer. Francis Romer was abusive, and he was also a gambling addict. Most of her income ended up being spent on various expenditures. As soon as that act was instated over in the government in Britain, she immediately filed for divorce, which was important because that didn't happen before, and that was very hard to do. And so she gained custody of her children, one of whom survived through young childhood, and she separated from Francis Romer, and then she established herself further in the academic fields of art. She started teaching, and she started trying to learn other under artists as well. She was studying under Charles Chaplin. who was a male artist that taught only female students, and he allowed them to study the nude model, which is also not allowed in this period. If you were not allowed to study the nude model, you were also not considered a true artist at this point. But that was it's a direct obstacle made by the academic institutions in this period. Louise Joplin circumvented that pretty masterfully. Then in 1882, there was the Private Property Act, where she was now allowed to sustain her own money, because even when she was divorced, she was not allowed to keep her own money. Her money was still shared by her husband, even though they were divorced. Once again, you were not, or it was shared by another notable man in her life, her brother or her father. That is just how it was. That's just what the government was structured around. That's how society was structured around women, let alone women in careers. Continuing on, she was a masterful portrait artist. She created a wonderful name for herself. She painted for the upper class societies. She tried to create a career where she could have a lifeline with salary, because she had her children, and she eventually married a man named Joseph Joplin. Joseph Joplin was a watercolor artist who was friends with John Everett Millais and James McNeill Whistler. Both were major artists within the 19th century and early 20th century. These artists were getting commissions for like $1,000 easily in their younger ages. And John Everett Millais, in the previous slide, painted this portrait of Louise Joplin, and they exchanged lots of paintings with one another. Louise Joplin, she practiced what was called the Orientalist movement, which is like the Chinese and Japanese influences on artwork, because there was a lot of trade going on in this period. And in the rightmost photo, it's a lithographic reproduction of a painting that's been lost, where it's called 5 O'Clock Tea. It was made in 1875, and she painted this little tea movement, and she exhibited this at her first exhibition at the Royal Academy at London in 1880, and it sold for $400. It was her first major piece that she sold. But that's a distinction there. Her first major piece sold for $400, while Whistler's major pieces sold for $1,000. Once again, the disparity is there. She eventually built wealth up for herself, and her connections with Whistler and Millais helped establish herself as a pioneer within women's suffrage movements. Her studios became a haven for meetings for women's rights. She pioneered lots of her own artist groups to work towards that until the day she died. And then we have Dorothy Hoxley. Dorothy Hoxley was born in 1884 to 1970. She is an artist that, mostly a watercolor artist, and she also tended towards Orientalist techniques, where she used watercolor to create this kind of flat technique. And what's notable about her technique is that she intermixed her mediums, which is something that you have to have a lot of practice doing. She used tempera, which is an egg-based pigment, and then she mixed it with watercolor to create a very vibrant pattern in her artwork. And then she also, while doing that, we found that she may have mixed further elements into it, like marble dust, which creates a glittery effect. And we found that because in one of the paintings we acquired for the gallery, there's this one called Sunday Afternoon. If you look at it in the lighting, it's got a glittery effect. And it's really remarkable for an artist to have that much practice and craft in doing that, because it's very, that could fall apart very easily. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong with mixing chemicals and other elements into your paintings, especially in this period. And she's much like Miss Amy E. Fisher, where she doesn't have a biography written on her. However, we know about her because she made connections later on in her life that later connected her to an art historian named John Christian. John Christian passed in 2016, and he collected her, on artists such as her when he first started back in the 1950s, when she was still alive. And he even wrote about her in his obituary. He wrote his own obituary. And then when he passed, it was published. published, and like she is starting to garner attention now through that. And this is more paintings on her, and this is this painting right here. This is Sir Sydney Cockerell. He used to be the director for the Fitzwilliam Museum. He, towards the latter part of his life, became friends with Dorothy Hoxley. She acted as his secretary, and there's lots of letters between them, like corresponding about artwork and going to patrons, and she made a lot of connections due to him, and they were not in a romantic partnership at all, but they had a very tight, lifelong friendship, and she helped him until the day he died. And these are more examples of like art techniques where she would also use gold underpainting. You can't really see it in these photographs, but she would use gold and silk underpainting to create these effects on the artwork, and it's quite remarkable to see them in person. We have, now we have Helen Allingham. Helen Allingham was born 1848 to 1926. Contrary to the other two artists, Miss Allingham is very conservative. She was not a pioneer for women's rights. She was okay in her station. She went to school for the Birmingham School of Arts and Design when she was younger, and then she later transferred to the Royal Academy of London, where she was able to study in some minor classes. You can do that. You just can't go to the portrait. She practiced what was known as cottage life, which is this rendition of the English cottage archetype, where you were able to foster this, she was able to foster this image of associating the English man with the English cottage, and this was during the pushback on the Industrial Revolution. So that nostalgia and that Rosette perspective on the olds is something that she was very well known for doing, and she had lots of positive reviews on her work. She was in lots of magazines talking about it. She was praised for it because she was advocating for the conservative narrative. This right here, this image in the right, that's Thomas Carlisle. Thomas Carlisle, I don't know if any of you have ever read old historic essays. He wrote something called well, basically, it's about the restatement of Christianity within Britain, and it's very, very racist. And he's also, he is a staunch supporter of keeping slavery at this period, and he was also a very good friend of the Allinghams. So if that gives you any inclination of where her values lie, there you go. But she was also very successful in her career until the day she died. She kept on making these paintings in the 1900s, and she was praised for them constantly and still is. And what this all means is the conclusion that I kind of came from my research is that the difference between a successful woman artist in the past and today is the fact that there needs to be connections built, and not only connections, but there has to be written support for their artwork and their careers. And if they don't have that, if there's not a support system for them, they're forgotten about, unlike their male counterparts, where they can establish themselves in a very easy manner without even trying sometimes. And that's it.